birth of the Star League. While Ian Cameron was slowly but surely laying the groundwork for the Star League, he didn't neglect Terra's role as mediator. All the while he was wooing the other major powers of the Inner Sphere, he also continued Terra's important role as adjudicator of disputes. In a number of these settlements, he was able to negotiate agreements that allowed the disputing governments to become co-rulers of a world, with the Terran hegemony as administrator of the government. In exchange, the hegemony received a percentage of the planet's gross income, and was able to extend its sphere of influence. By 2555, the hegemony was part owner of almost 30 such worlds, arranged in 5 ragged lines radiating out along the borders of the Inner Sphere. These planets were almost all resource-rich, and while the hegemony's cut in the planet's resources seldom amounted to more than 10% of the planet's total gross product, that still added up to a substantial amount of manufactured goods and raw resources. Cameron had already gone a long way to solving Terra's economic problems. The creation of a Star League would complete the task. The hegemony's role as peacemaker was a great success publicly, and director Ian Cameron was hailed as the greatest leader since James McKenna. Meanwhile, for the next 13 years, he continued his relentless but secret campaign to persuade the rest of the Inner Sphere to join him in the Star League. It has been said that he was a man with a golden tongue, a skilled and charismatic negotiator. What few people know or wish to recognise was that Cameron had a very special assistant in his quest. That man was Albert Marek, who was able to offer clandestine and often devious assistance along the path that would eventually lead mankind to the Star League. Modern historians now date the end of the Age of War with the signing of the Andurian Peace Treaty of 2556. Terence Lau's invasion of the Andurian system must have been a kind of last gasp, for the people of the Inner Sphere had long since grown weary of the continual stress of war. By 2566, interstellar manufacture and trade in consumer goods had already begun to pick up because of the loosening of wartime priorities and trade restriction. Raw materials were flowing into the hegemony at an unprecedented rate, creating a major expansion of heavy and technical industries. The hegemony was also doing a brisk business selling their finished products to the other states. With the general thaw, Cameron negotiated numerous trade and non-aggression pacts that led to lowering of nearly all trade barriers in the Inner Sphere and to a near-total ceasefire. No matter how much other houses might hold out against the idea of a Star League, Cameron and his secret ally Albert Marek knew that it was just a matter of time. The other realms were experiencing similar economic booms, though the Lyran Commonwealth was having difficulty meshing its economy with the others. The Steiner government was at first unprepared to regulate the sudden inflow of money and resources, whose planets were swallowed up by foreign industry while immigrants came pouring into the Commonwealth in search of jobs. Archon Tracial Steiner was finally forced to reimpose the trade barriers while her government rearranged, enlarged and strengthened its power to control business. Politically, the treaties had brought near peace to the Inner Sphere. The remaining occasional outbreak of violence were mainly grudge matches between groups of soldiers on contested planets. In the main, things had become so quiet that a few Inner Sphere leaders were considering agreements that would allow them to stand down their militaries. The New Order. People everywhere greeted news of the Star League with excitement and anticipation. Things would be changing, and any change was welcome after the long age of war. Even citizens of worlds little affected by the Star League wanted the New Order to succeed. First, however, the Star League had to set up its government, which required more than 3 years of intensive negotiation by the leaders of all 6 realms. During this time, the fragile nature of the new alliance was threatened more than once. The Star League High Council, composed of the heads of the 6 member states, was created almost immediately after the signing of the Accords. To acknowledge Ian Cameron's status, he would be known as First Lord. Not only was Cameron the prime mover behind creation of the Star League, but he was also the ruler of Terra, the cradle of man, which lay quite literally at the centre of human-occupied space. The High Council would be the pinnacle of the Star League government, as well as a communications nexus for the swift dissemination of information to all the member states. The Star League capital was located near the newly pristine Puget Sound of the North American continent of Terra. Construction had actually begun years earlier on what would be known officially as the Court of the Star League, but unofficially as Unity City. The city was to be huge, elaborate and awe-inspiring as befits the centre of humanity. Materials from all member states were incorporated into its construction, and once built, the Court of the Star League was hailed as an architectural marvel. One visiting architect called it a fairy tale place where parking garages were as beautiful as the Taj Mahal. At this time, the original High Council of the Terran Hegemony changed their name and rank from Now on, they would be known as the First Lord's advisors, and headed up major departments within the hegemony government in Geneva. Though the scope of their work was technically limited to aiding the First Lord governing the hegemony, they often provided unofficial counsel on other matters. Lord Ian soon realised that his duties as First Lord, and the current political situation, made it impossible to rule the Terran hegemony effectively. In 2572, he assigned his Director General responsibilities to either his heir or to the President of the Hegemony Congress, and from that day on, the Camerons would always consider themselves Star League rulers first, Hegemony Directors General second. In 2573, the Bureau of Star League Affairs, or BSLA, was officially created. This heart and body of the Star League government had 6 major departments: social relation, economic relations, Star League revenue, Department of Education and Information, Star League Attorney General, and Star League Administrators. The Department of Administrators was the most important. It was run by 5 state administrators appointed by the First Lord and directly responsible for seeing that each member state carried out the First Lord and the High Council's decisions. Under each state administrator were various regional and planetary administrators who reported to their superiors and to the government of the member state. The government of the new Star League was designed to be a strong yet flexible instrument to carry out the will of the First Lord and the Lords of the High Council. First Lord Cameron appointed more than 3/4 of the personnel to staff the BSLA's bureaucratic posts, which gained him virtual dominance over the functioning of the Star League government. As for First Lord Cameron, he was circumspect in his use of his vast power. He often consulted with the other council lords about his appointments and tried where possible to find posts for anyone whom a particular lord wished to favour. Prelude to War. It is ironic that the Star League, whose stated purpose was peace and goodwill amongst the stars, should have made war its first major undertaking. Known as the Reunification War, this conflict would claim more lives in 20 years of brutal fighting than had the Age of War, which lasted a century and a half. The purpose of the Reunification War was to bring the major governments of the periphery into the Star League by force of arms. Within weeks after signing the Star League Accords, Ian Cameron sent copies of these to each of the major periphery states, all of whom rejected the offer within a year. In public, the First Lord and his council lords expressed regret over this refusal, but the periphery leaders had played right into their hands. Like nearly every powerful government that came before or after it, the Star League had suffered from the imperialist urge to dominate. If they were no longer going to be warring with each other, then they would go to war with the periphery. Ian Cameron began to refer to the periphery as the Lost World, while instructing the Star League propaganda machine to produce a variety of materials portraying the Outworlders as everything from prodigal sons and daughters to the most murderous Neanderthals. Cameron also kept Star League diplomats busy making such proposals to the periphery leaders as a Galactic Summit on Terror in 2572, which every periphery government except the Rimworlds refused to attend, or a Favoured Nation trade package with the Taurian Concordat in 2573. The latter was particularly specious, for the Taurians' local products were superior to the exports the Star League that was offered at the time. There was another, more pressing reason for a war against the proud and independent periphery governments. Now that real cooperation existed between the great houses of the Inner Sphere, every government would have to significantly reduce their standing army. Even with the troops being contributed to the Star League Defence Forces, this would still leave hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened veterans without work, and without any other marketable skill. The creation of the Star League Defence Forces took the best soldiers from each member state, while the cream of the remainder quickly rose in the ranks of the individual state militaries. Yet even as the largest military force in mankind's history was being created, the new era of peace sent many trained soldiers back into civilian life. Many soldiers suddenly faced the unpleasant prospect of having to beat their sword into ploughshares. Most had joined the military as young men and women, and it was all they knew, all they were trained to do, and now they were suddenly expected to return to a civilian life. Many veterans found work as bodyguards for local nobles, and others banded into fighting units that hired out to nobles and governments to combat roving brigands. Some veterans, however, felt so lost that it was they who became the brigands preying upon their former masters. One of the gravest questions dominating High Council meetings of the period was what to do about the millions of unemployed soldiers now roaming the Star League. The Reunification War. The Reunification War was in reality 4 separate campaigns fought against the Taurian Concordat, the Magistracy of Canopus, the Outworlds Alliance, and the Rimworlds Republic. Though the government of the Inner Sphere tended to lump together these distant governments, the periphery is, of course, not a place with astrographical boundaries, but merely the name for the vast space surrounding the borders of the Inner Sphere. Compared to the might of the Star League, or even to any of the great houses that formed it, the periphery government seemed like a relatively easy picking. Yet, the armies of these realms put up such a fierce struggle to retain autonomy that it took the SLDF more than 20 years to subdue them. Through the various bloody battles in the Reunification War, a ceasefire was finally reached with the Outworlds Alliance in 2585. The Magistracy of Canopus was defeated in 2588. The insurrection in the Rimworld's Republic was extinguished in 2596, and the Turian Concordat finally defeated in 2596. Each periphery realm in turn was then forced for a reconstruction at their cost, and some worlds, particularly Turian ones, being annexed by neighbouring member states. Upon completion of reconstruction, each periphery realm was made a non-voting territorial state. Though these territorial states held little external sway, each was allowed to enact Star League laws as it saw fit. Usually all Star League laws passed through with little more than a legislative rubber stamp. In 2600, Lady Chandra Cameron died. 2 years later, Lord Ian Cameron would follow her. The Star League marked their deaths with a year of official mourning, and the High Council Lords ordered all Star League officials to wear black and all official vehicles to display a black stripe. This would become a tradition after the passing of every subsequent First Lord. Economic and scientific advances. Though a minor economic depression affected every government immediately following the Reunification War, the Innisphere began to boom as corporations retooled their factories to produce civilian rather than military items. Trade with the new territorial states was especially profitable because they lacked almost everything and were willing to pay with raw, vital resources from their worlds. Once again, it was cargo ships laden with goods rather than SLDF troop ships making their way amongst the worlds of the periphery. The period, from roughly 2600 to 2650, has often been referred to as the Good Years. Freed from the demands of researching ever more potent weapons and of churning them out for war, the leaders of Star League member states could direct their scientific and industrial resources toward creating a better life for all. The Terran hegemony, the Federated Suns, and the Lyran Commonwealth were the leaders in research and development, but the whole race benefited from the fruits of this research. The Terran hegemony could now return to what it knew best: high technology. Spurred on by a series of decrees from the Director General, major industries adopted long-range plans for research programs aimed at widening the hegemony's technological edge. Also important in shaping the hegemony's future was a series of secret messages only recently discovered by Comstar researchers, in which the government urged these same industries to voluntarily reinstate the ban on selling advanced technology. This was because the Camerons were still not convinced that no other lord would challenge their power. In return, the new First Lord Nicholas awarded the firms lucrative military contracts to make up for any business lost. Perhaps the most significant technological development during Nicholas Cameron's reign was the hyperpulse generator. The origins of the HPG go back to the equations of the great professors Kearney and Fukuda. In one obscure section of their papers, published in 2022, they speculated on the possibility of creating artificial joint points, and they provided equations for generating them. Because the costs would have been astronomical then, the scientific community didn't pursue these hypotheses any further. Simon Cameron. By 2738, the 39-year-old Simon Cameron had been Director General of the Terran hegemony for 4 years. Because of his experience in dealing with hegemony bureaucracy, he was amply qualified to become the First Lord. He was neither glib nor suave, he was no-nonsense ruler who spoke his mind bluntly and made even blunter demands. Beneath the brutally practical side of Simon, though, was a deep idealism. He read voraciously, as did most Camerons, and the authors he most admired were members of the recent modern chivalrous movement, writers such as Euston de Kirk, Toshihiro Orikiro, Mina Samuels, and Bonnie Kraken, believers in a strict code of personal behaviour, deeply influenced the new First Lord's early development. So much so, he even appointed Mina Samuels as one of his advisors. Modern chivalrists tried to adapt an ancient code to the modern era. They believed that morality and honour depended on 3 separate but entwined beliefs: belief in ever-present God, a belief in goodness, and a belief in strict mutual loyalty between a liege lord and his subjects. Because of their reliance on medieval writings and poetry, the modern chivalrists often referred to ancient legends such as King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table to drive home a point. It wasn't long before medievalism became the rage throughout the Star League. It soon influenced almost all aspects of the culture, with even societies far removed from the European tradition eventually taking a lively interest in the modern chivalrists. The pervasive legends of courtly love and feats of honour achieved by moral knights soon became tragic threads in the tapestry of events. The First Lord encountered difficulty adapting his strict morals to the administration of the League. When he was Director General, he'd ruled a homogenous realm whose people agreed with his beliefs. To rule 10 different states, each with its own culture and values, was much different and much more complicated. Though he believed in a strong military, First Lord Simon spurned the space defence systems that were so important to his predecessor. He allowed the completion of the partially built SDS networks but cancelled plans for the rest. Anticipating trouble in the periphery, First Lord Simon instead ordered the construction of massive fortifications on key worlds in the 4 states. These forts were virtual copies of the ancient Castle Bryan, still in use on hegemony worlds to this day. Trouble in the periphery. By the time Simon Cameron came to power in 2738, the good years were over for the 4 periphery states. Gone were the days when the people in those distant worlds willingly obeyed the regulations coming from the inner sphere. There was a deepening anger instead. The people of the periphery had many reasons to feel as they did. First Lord Jonathan Cameron, preoccupied by his visions and worried about unrest in the periphery, had trusted the Council Lord's explanation of Directive 41 and signed it without further ado in 2722. The directive, written by the Lords from the Capellan Confederation and the Free Worlds League, appeared to grant the periphery states limited autonomy, freeing them from many restrictions imposed by the Reunification War. The freedoms, though, were only cosmetic. Though changes did occur, the real power merely shifted from the Bureau of Star League Affairs to the governments and businesses of the inner sphere. Despite the withdrawal of the periphery administrators, who could veto laws proposed by the periphery governments, ambassadors of the inner sphere realms held the real power. The 5 greedy lords had tricked the First Lord into signing the directive, and the BSLA had monitored and restricted exploitation of periphery resources, but the new system allowed inner sphere businesses to suck the periphery dry. Hegemony companies were no exception to this. A wave of exploitative businesses swamped the periphery worlds, setting up factories that consumed whole sections of planets. Products were sent to the inner sphere without benefit to anybody in the periphery. Unaware that the rape of their lands was the fault of the Council Lords and not the First Lord, citizens of the periphery focused their anger on the Camerons. Demonstrations outside Star League offices became common, and underground independence movements gained wide support. By the time Simon had become First Lord, periphery support for the League had deteriorated beyond redemption. Lord Simon knew that Council Directive 41 was to blame, but recent divisiveness, such as the Davian War of Succession, left him in no position to try to repeal it. Instead, he strengthened military forces in the territories while privately condemning the Council Lords for their greed. What worried the First Lord most was that scattered throughout the periphery were 20 weapons manufacturers capable of turning out battlemechs, heavy tanks and dropships. These manufacturers were under no scrutiny and no constraint. The First Lord learned from his agents that the factories operated around the clock, and that anonymous parties purchased most of the weapons, which would then disappear without a trace. The possibility that the militaries of the 4 periphery realms could equal the regular army prompted the First Lord to build more fortresses in the periphery. The First Lord hoped that the fortresses would be able to contain any uprising until help could arrive from the interior. The Rimworld's Republic, ruled by the Amaris family, seemed to be the only periphery realm that the Star League could trust. Everyone daily pledged allegiance to the League and terror, but a closer look at the Amaris' high praise and admiration for the League made some observers sceptical. The Republic's military furthered the uneasiness. The number of Rimworld's regiments, while technically limited by the Edict of 2650, was actually 3 to 4 times the size if one counted the reserve and militia units, which could be fielded on short notice. The First Lord, heeding reports from agents, kept the Rimworld's Republic under control by building even more fortresses there than in any other periphery state. The death of Simon Cameron. In 2751, the First Lord visited the disputed world of Star's End on the Lyran Rimworld's border. While there, Simon was invited to visit the mining facilities of the large asteroid of New Silesia. Though it was not on his itinerary, Cameron accepted because of his interest in low-gravity mining. On New Silesia, the First Lord met with the men and women living in the company's small domed city. Intrigued by their life, he eagerly accepted an offer to see how they earned their living. Simon Cameron and his entourage travelled down to the tunnels where the precious titanium and selenium ores were extracted from the asteroid. What he saw was a typical low-G mining operation. Mining robots cut at the asteroid with a series of lasers and diamond bits, while the robot's operator sat at the end of a pressurised tunnel a short distance away, using a control system that was very similar to a MechWarrior's control panel. In Tunnel 5T, level 42, the First Lord asked if he could control the mining robot. As he'd been a MechWarrior and was familiar with the Neuro helmet and controls of the mining robot, no one objected. He donned the helmet and confidently took to the controls, looking through the thick glass window into the vacuum of the tunnel where the robot sat idling. What happened next is uncertain. Cameras recording the event from inside the control booth and on the robot indicate that the First Lord must have made a mistake. The mining robot, which had been working at the far end of the tunnel, wheeled and charged the control booth. Simon Cameron tried to shut the robot down, but he either didn't know how to, or the robot didn't respond to the command. The 30-ton machine crashed into the control booth, shattering the porthole through which the First Lord had been looking. The decompression sucked him through with such great force against the front of the robot. His death was quick. 9 other people also died. First Lord Simon's death was not only a tragic shock, but it left the Star League without a leader when it needed one the most. Lord Simon's only child, Richard Cameron II, was barely 8 years old. Richard's mother had died a year earlier, and nor was there any other Cameron family member qualified to become First Lord. Where was the League to turn for leadership? Richard Cameron was the Star League's only hope, but it would be at least a decade before he could rule effectively. Would there still be a League then? Many people couldn't imagine that the Council Lords would do anything but fight for ascendancy in the absence of a First Lord. Many others predicted that war was inevitable. Fables and fairy tales. Richard, like all Camerons, grew up keenly aware of his family's history, nourished from childhood by tales about its famous ancestors. They were fairy tales, bedtime stories laced with virtue and passion and action, but regrettably short on fact. Richard's parents didn't worry about the stories that would give their child the wrong impression. There was plenty of time for him to learn the unvarnished truth. Then they died, leaving their child with the grandly romantic stories permanently etched in his mind as the truth about his line. As he grew, Richard began reading all he could about the great romantic heroes of literature. He became obsessed with figures such as King Arthur, Charlemagne, Roland and Aragon because they reminded him of what he thought his parents were and what he should be. The many histories of the Cameron family didn't interest Richard. He said they were too dark and filled with depressing lies. Young Richard had very few people to turn to after his parents died. He only had a handful of distant relatives and they were scattered across the League, and because of his importance the few children at Unity City shied away from him. Teachers, butlers and maids were the only people that he would see for days, and none of them seemed able to look past his title and see the very lonely boy. Richard delved ever deeper into his books about kings, queens, and knights. Amaris, the Schemer. Stefan Amaris, leader of the Rimworld's Republic, became a frequent visitor to the court of the Star League during the Regency. As leader of the Periphery's most pro-League realm, his presence at the court was welcomed by some, but most looked down on anyone from the Periphery. By making himself up like a bad imitation of Genghis Khan and deliberately playing the country bumpkin in public, Stefan Amaris played on these prejudices to mask his cunning. Seeing this seemingly harmless roly-poly man, few thought to question why the ruler of such a distant realm suddenly showed such an interest in court life. Hidden behind Amaris's unimpressive exterior was a grand schemer. Ever since he could remember, Stefan had believed that his family and his realm had suffered at the hands of the Star League like the poor relations of a rich family. He felt the Star League and the Camerons had spent the last 2 centuries either ignoring the Amaris family's diligent attempts to show their worthiness, or by behaving like a club-wielding policeman the instant the Amarises made a minor mistake. Stefan Amaris had decided early in his life that he would avenge himself on the Camerons and the Star League and prove the Amaris name worthy of recognition. With the death of Simon Cameron, Amaris got the break he needed. The moment he heard about the First Lord's death, he began to read and study everything he could about young Richard Cameron. His likes, dislikes, what he read, and what he watched. And once he felt he understood this lonely boy, Amaris left the Republic for Terra.